The American presidents were people like you and like me, at least that's how the founders intended them to be. Welcome back to my new segment on the American presidents and their nicknames. Last time we covered the positive nicknames of our very first president, George Washington. But he had enemies too. What about negative nicknames, something somebody would have called him to mock him? So the most obvious negative nickname is going to be King George or King Washington. As the leader of a new country and a new country formed out of a former British colony, it was inevitable that George Washington would be compared to a George of the same name, the leader of England, King George III. But this went beyond the two being the heads of their respective militaries during the Revolutionary War. They were compared to each other throughout George Washington's first and second term as president. The political opponents of George Washington, particularly in his second term, began to grumble and gripe about his pomp and circumstance and his centralized power. You see, George Washington liked to host these things called levees. These were formal receptions where he carried himself with aristocratic ceremony. And this kind of regal bearing couldn't be explained away by the fact that he was an immigrant, because he wasn't. George Washington was a third-generation American. It was his great-great-grandfather who had initially moved to the state of Virginia. Continued support of centralized financial visions put forth by Alexander Hamilton.
My name is Alexander Hamilton.
And his rather heavy-handed response to the Whiskey Rebellion kind of painted him out to be somewhat of a monarch. And because of this, many of his political opponents feared that he would turn into a dictator. Now, of course, we have the benefit of hindsight, but calling George Washington King George must have seemed appropriate at the time. An even darker negative nickname for George Washington is Conocotorius. And I might have mispronounced that incorrectly because it is a Native American nickname given to him by the Seneca. This name is commonly translated as Town Destroyer and was first given to his great-grandfather, John Washington. You see, in the 1670s, when the British were really starting to ramp up their colonization efforts in what would become Virginia, John Washington participated in several violent struggles where many Native American villages were entirely massacred. This nickname was used for John Washington by the Susquehannock people, but why did it stick to his grandson? Well, in the pre-Revolution era, during the conflict known as the French and Indian War, which really was just the American theater of the 7 Years' War, Washington participated in several attacks against Native American people. George Washington's clashes with Native peoples continued well into the American Revolution, particularly with the Sullivan Expedition of 1795. The name was likely revived and reapplied to George Washington when he ordered this expedition, a scorched earth campaign against the Haudenosaunee Confederacy that had mostly allied themselves with the British during that war. We have evidence that not only did George Washington know about the use of this nickname, he encouraged it. There's a signed letter from George Washington to the leaders of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy where he lists himself under the name Conocotorius. To the native leaders, this negative nickname symbolized destruction, cultural annihilation, and Washington's true ruthlessness. This nickname wasn't just another battlefield epithet, it was a symbol of moral condemnation by the native peoples. You see, this is why it's important to remember the duality of man and recognize the fact that our founders were people. Good and bad both within them. The last nickname returns to a little bit of levity. A more obscure nickname used in his early career was the Stepchild of Fortune. Washington's early military career was disastrous, particularly the event in which his unit was massacred and started the French and Indian War and caused the 7-Year War to spill over to an entirely new continent. Not only that, but during the early Revolutionary War, the Continental Army suffered loss after loss after loss, and it looked like the British were going to win until a series of key turnaround battles where Washington really showed his success. So perhaps he was a true stepchild of fortune. So those are 3 negative nicknames of our first president and the nation's founder, George Washington. I'm Teddy Ebby. Join me next time when we talk about both the positive and negative nicknames of our second president, John Adams.